Okay, into the Word, into the World Bible study. Let's start our class off, everyone. All right. All right. Here we go. We've had a nice Christmas and New Year break, and we're ready to get back into the Word, into the world. We're in lesson number 9 today, and it's about security. And so let us go ahead and get started. It's about security. It's about the people with a king. Very significant event in the people of the Hebrews' lives when they now decide they want a king. And we're going to delve into the various kings, Samuel, Saul, and David today. All right, so let us get ourselves prepared. If someone would read the scripture there for us, please.
If you will fear the Lord and serve him and heed his voice and not rebel against the commandment of the Lord, and if both you and the king who reigns over you will follow the Lord your God, it will be well. But if you will not heed the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then the hand of the Lord will be against you and your king.
Okay, so we have a clear caution. Let's put it this way. We'll just leave the mic on. A clear caution that we are given here, or they are given here, if you fear the Lord and serve him and heed his voice and do not rebel against the commandments of the Lord, and if both you and the king, that person who leads you, it takes both the people and the leader. It really takes that combination. If both of you and the king reign over you, will follow the Lord your God, it will be well. But, and that's what God does many times, there's two options. You can have this or you can have that. In this case, it'll go well with you if both of you follow. But if you do not heed the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then the hand of the Lord will be against you and your king. And so against you and your leader. God himself will be against you. And that's not a position you ever want to be in when God's against you.
Right.
Okay, so we have the warning. We're now getting to day 1, which is 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 1 through chapter 7. And we're going to take a look at the various kings, or let's say prophet first, and then kings. And so what we want to do is, as you get to Samuel, what you'll notice is Samuel is right after Ruth. 1 Samuel is right after Ruth. And Ruth is right after Judges. Now that's very strategically done because Ruth is a part of the period of the Judges. And so when they wanted to place Ruth, they placed it historically in the right place. She was living during the time of the Judges before the time of the Kings. So that's why, if you ever wonder why is Ruth right after Judges and before 1 Samuel, that's why. Because historically that's where it fits. But I want you to, and since you found 1 Samuel, just go over a couple pages to Judges. And we're going to find out where we leave the people of the Hebrew people, the people of Israel, where we leave them and why they're going into this era with the kings. And so if you take a look at the very last chapter of Judges, which is chapter 21, and then verse 25, if someone would find that and read that for us. Verse 25 of Judges chapter 21.
In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes.
Okay, so we get a sense there was no king. So we know that they had not started the kings yet, the reign of kings. And everybody did what was in their own eyes. Yes.
Pastor, does that mean they had no authority over them at that time? Since they say everyone did as they please?
Well, it's a statement of how far they had declined. They had judges, and judges were those chosen by God to lead them. They were not kings. They were a ruler picked by God to watch over them, much like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were not a king, but they led the people. The judges were those who led the people of God, but were not yet considered kings. And we're going to learn what the significance is to have a king. And so therefore, what had happened is that because they were unruly and they did not follow God, then they slowly disintegrated as a nation. They started off fighting against their enemies. And if you ever read Judges from beginning to end, they started off fighting their various enemies. But by the time they got to chapter 21, they were now fighting each other. They were no longer fighting their outside enemies. They were warring. They were divided. They were fighting each other. And so that last statement there is a statement of how far they had fallen. That there was no ruler, no king. And it also sets us up for the kingdom then. So why would they mention that there was no king if maybe they were now getting to the point where they did want one? Okay. Okay. Very good. Very good observation. Okay, so now we go to chapter 1 of Samuel. And we're going to start going through what happens here with Samuel. Okay. First of all, question for you, not a trick question. Was Samuel a king?
No, he was the last of the judges.
There you go.
Yeah.
See, now again, why then we pick up right out of the judges and go into Samuel. He was the last of the judges. He was last of these chosen rulers to lead God's people. Anyone have an opinion on whether Samuel was a good judge or not? Was he a good judge? From what you remember on him?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think he was a good judge. Some parts mentioned that he was a prophet in his own way,
Yes, he
but a judge by nature.
Yeah. Very good. He was both judge and prophet.
Yeah,
And so
and his
therefore
father trained him very well.
Yeah, he was
Yeah.
speaking in behalf of God in every instance, and very loyal to it.
Yeah.
Very, very loyal to it. Okay, so now let's take a look at Samuel then. Now, as we move into Samuel, and 1 Samuel chapter 10, someone take us there then and read chapter 1, verse 10. Well, let's start with verse 9 through 16, if someone would then. 1 Samuel 9 through 16.
So Hannah arose after they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat by the doorpost of the tabernacle of the Lord. And she was in bitterness of soul, and prayed to the Lord, and wept in anguish. Then she made a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant, and remember me, and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a male child, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall come upon his head. And it happened as she continued praying before the Lord that Eli watched her mouth. Now Hannah spoke in her heart, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she was drunk. So Eli said to her, How long will you be drunk? Put your wine away from you. But Hannah answered and said, No, my Lord, I am a woman of sorrowful spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor intoxicating drink, but have poured out my soul before the Lord. Do not consider your maidservant a wicked woman, for out of the abundance of my complaint and grief I have spoken until now.
Okay, all right. So now we have a woman who they refer to as barren, a woman who was unable to bear a child. Any other comparisons that you know of women in the Bible who did not or could not bear a child?
No, go ahead. One I thought of was Sarah,
Yeah,
one of the early ones.
yeah. Sarah was another one, wasn't she? Right. And so we find these accounts, where God intercedes and God intervenes in a woman's distress or a father's distress, wanting a child and giving them a child because it was critical for them, especially in that day and era, to have a child and to be able to propagate and continue on with the line within their family. Now, someone take us down to chapter 1 of 1 Samuel, verse 21 through the end of the chapter.
And the man Elkanah and all his house went up to offer unto the Lord the yearly sacrifice and his vow. But Hannah went not up, for she said unto her husband, I will not go up until the child be weaned, and then I will bring him. that he may appear before the Lord, and there abide forever. And Elkanah, her husband, said unto her, Do what seemeth thee good. Tear it unto thou have winded him. Only the Lord established his word. So the woman abode and gave her son, stuck until she winded him. And when she had winded him, she took him up with her with 3 bullocks and 1 ephah of flour and a bottle of wine, and brought him into the house of the Lord in Shiloh, and the child was young. And thou slew the bullock and brought the child to Eli. And she said, O my Lord, as thou so liveth, my Lord, I am the woman that stood by thee here praying unto the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord hath given me my pension which I asked of him. Therefore also I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he liveth, he shall be lent to the Lord. And he whispered the Lord thee.
Okay.
Oh, he worshiped the Lord thee, I'm sorry.
Okay. And so what's significant here is that because of her appreciation of having the child, it was a common thing to have your first child be a Levite where they would be given for a period of time. But what she did is she gave her child for his whole life. And that was major. It's okay to have for a period of time, but out of her appreciation, deep appreciation, she gave her child to the Lord for his whole life. And so now we have this child who is set aside for his whole life. Yeah.
I understand that, but why did they use the word lent? That she lent her child to the Lord?
Maybe because it's like she's still hers. She's still hers, or he is still hers. But she's going to give him to the Lord. Amen.
It reminds me, too, that some of us, myself, in the past, have prayed so hard for something to materialize, and it did. Yeah. And we believe God had his hand in it. Yet and still we weren't as faithful for what we promised him that we would do afterwards. And I think we still do that. And we're not mindful that he gets everything.
Yes.
You have to be totally faithful like he was to you. And you come out on top.
Yeah. And we wrestle with that. Our nature is to own and possess and keep for our own use and for our own desires. But, everything belongs to God. Everything belongs to him. And he's only lent it to us for a period of time. And so therefore, since it doesn't really belong to us, then we're only giving a portion back to what belongs to God in the first place. When it comes to the tithe, when it comes to our time, when it comes to our talents, our youthfulness or our energies, it's only given a portion back to him because it all belongs to him anyway. Because eventually it all goes back to him. And so therefore, when we have a different mindset, then we're not as selfish and self-centered because we know where it comes from. Okay. All right, so even in this case, a child. Now what's really interesting now is we have this child from Hannah who is given to the Lord, and she's going to ensure that he is raised as a young man of God. But there's an equal problem or a story going on, and that's with Eli, the prophet. Now if you go over to chapter 2, verse 11, and read verse 11, let's say go through 17. And there's a counter story that's transpiring.
Then Elkanah went home to Ramah, but the boy ministered before the Lord under Eli the priest. Eli's sons were wicked men. They had no regard for the Lord. Now it was the practice of the priests with the people that whenever anyone offered a sacrifice, and while the meat was being boiled, the servant of the priest would come with the 3-pronged fork in his hand. He would plunge it into the pan or kettle of candle or pot, and the priest would take for himself whatever the fork brought up. This is how they treated all the Israelites who came to Shiloh. But even before the fat was burned, the servant of the priest would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, "Give the priest some meat to roast." He won't accept boiled meat from you, but only raw. If the man said to him, "Let the fat be burned up first, and then take whatever you want," the servant would then answer, "No, hand it over now. If you don't, I will take it by force." This sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight, for they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt.
Okay, let's pause there. What does that say to you about that which is offered to God? And let's put it in today's context. We give our tithes and our offerings. We do what they call a heave offering. When you raise it up, that's called a heave offering. And we sing, all things come of thee. And unto you, Lord, we give. So now what we've done is we've consecrated these offerings in monetary form. What does it say then how that must be handled once it has been given to the Lord and consecrated? Because we see another example here.
Well, it's holy.
Yes.
And it should be treated as holy, sacred, and we're giving God the best of what we have, and we have consecrated it by giving it to Him, and it shouldn't be defiled in any way.
And then let's take another step further then. What about its use? Here's an issue of usage. This meat was going to go to the priest, because that was the Levitical law. A portion of the sacrifices went to the Levites because they did not have land to be able to raise their own cattle and produce their own crops. They depended upon the people's tithes and offerings for their subsistence. And then they were to give a tithe as well too. And that's why we do the same thing we do here in this church. But then it's the issue of the use of it. What was the problem with the use of it here? Why was that an issue? Listen to some of the words they said. And if the man said, "Let me burn the fat off first and then take whatever you wish," this guy is bargaining with this priest. He would say, "No, you must give it now. And if not, I will take it by force." What do you see in the use of this sacrifice that the people of God have given in the hands of the priest? How are they treating it?
After you have prayed and it's been consecrated, you should be prayerfully thought of how to use this for the sake of God, church activity. And even today, there may be someone in the audience of that activity that think that we should use this for something else and just earmark it for something else. But that's what you prayed over. You understand? And between the pastor and those that he have picked to prayerfully do this for the church, there should be an understanding that it has to be like this. You prayerfully and consecrated it already. Let's use it for the sake of God's future.
Yeah, I think it's very well put. We're using this now as just not ordinary money, just like the juice and the wafers that we have on communion. It's just grape juice. But if you're very careful and astute, you know that there's a prayer of consecration that the chief celebrant, the pastor, usually prays. And it says, here's where we seek to make these elements now holy. And so although it's still juice and it's still a wafer, it is now holy and is to be treated as something holy. So when we do that raise offering, it is now holy. So you have to use that, in this case, our case, money, in a very holy fashion. It's not for just common, ordinary use to be rifled through and grabbed at to get what you want. It is now sacred for the use of God's work. And so it's very significant. And you can see that parallel between, and especially today's time where we've seen some misuse of church funds. This speaks to that. Yes. And as a result of that, God has an opinion about those who rifle after what people have given as a sacrifice to the Lord. Okay, so as a result of that then, we find that there's a problem. And so someone would now go to verse 22 of chapter 2 and go down 22 through 26 and read that then.
Now Eli was very old and heard all that his sons did unto all Israel, and how they lay with the women that assembled at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. And he said unto them, Why do you do such things? For I hear of your evil dealings by all the people. Nay, my sons, for it is no good report that I hear. You make the Lord's people to transgress. If one man sin against another, the judge should judge him. But if a man sin against the Lord, who shall entreat for him? Notwithstanding, they hearken not unto the voice of their father, because the Lord would slay them. And the child Samuel grew on, and was in favor both with the Lord and also with men. And there came a man of God.
Let's pause there. Let's pause there. Okay, so now we see what's happening, don't we? Who are going to be the ones who are going to succeed Eli? Who were his heir apparents? Who was going to succeed after him? Go ahead.
It was going to be his sons.
That's right. Because it was passed through the family. The Levites trained their children, trained their sons specifically, and their sons trained their sons. The priests trained their sons who trained their sons. They were called, that whole group of people, the Levites were called to that task. They were called to be holy, as well as the descendants of Aaron were to be holy as the priests. So they were set aside for that purpose. And so therefore his sons were intentionally set aside for that purpose, but because of how he saw them behave, then that was not going to be the case. So they broke that, and that did not happen. And so as a result of that, then we know then Samuel, take it to chapter 3 if you would. You got a question there? Yeah.
Were Samuel or Eli's sons taking their position for granted, or thinking that since this is the tradition, they could just do anything that they want to?
What do you think? What do you think?
Yes.
Rhetorical question. Yeah, it's apparent. So therefore, what God has called us to should not be taken for granted. You know, I've been in this church for so and so years, and this, and I've been that, ever since I've been here, so therefore I ought to. No. You don't take it for granted. It is a high calling to do anything for the Lord. And it should always be treated that way. And if one does not, then they should not take the position, because it is a high calling. It's just not a normal job. Okay, let's go to chapter 3 now, if you would, please. We'll start off in verse 1, and let's go through 9. Chapter 3 of 1 Samuel, 1 through 9.
The boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. One night, Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was lying down in his usual place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called Samuel. Samuel answered, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." But Eli said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." So he went and lay down. Again the Lord called Samuel, and Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." "My son," Eli said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The Lord called Samuel a third time, and Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." Then Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, "Go and lie down, and if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place.
Okay, all right. And so then, can anyone tell me what happens then Does the Lord come to Samuel?
Well, when he called Samuel this time, Samuel did what Eli said.
right.
He said,
right.
speak, for your servant is listening.
Yes. Yes.
So that's how he responded then.
Okay, so now what happened unique here, and you see it, you know, in the very first part of it, it says that there were not visions, and the Lord had not been speaking. So what happened significantly here? Okay, so what happened significantly, as everyone already understood, is that God started speaking, right? There you go. I know it was not a trick question. I'm sorry. But anyway, go ahead, Ray. Yeah.
I see too, it took an experienced person that's close to God sometimes has to steer you.
Yes.
And God uses that person to steer you toward what God wants you to do.
That's right.
Sometimes it comes like,
Yeah, and it takes, you know, not only experience, but an anointed person.
yes.
Someone who is in tune with God. Because, again, as we talk about the offering, it is sacred, and everything that's done for the Lord is sacred. And so you just don't pick people at random and say, hey, why don't you handle the money? And then, oh, okay, why don't you handle the property? No, that's not how you do that. You know? And I would go as far as saying, too, just because you're a banker doesn't mean you should handle the money. And just because you're a contractor doesn't mean you should be taking care of the property. The skill might be there, but the important thing is the spirit there. Does a person see this as a holy calling? Do they see it as being done unto the Lord? And that makes a big difference. Big difference. Okay, so we find that this vetting process, this screening process, and it is by God. And we also find here is that God called him, didn't he? And so he has this conversation, this vision of God, and God speaks to him. And so now then, it's not him volunteering. It's not that he saw this was a lucrative profession to be in. It was not that it had promises of riches. It was a calling of God to serve God, because a mother who had given that child had given him to the Lord. Very interesting, isn't it? Very interesting. I mean, one time in church, a husband and wife had their first child. And the husband, this is his second marriage, and his first children didn't fare too well. So when he had this relationship, which was done in God's house, and it was done by the anointing, the first Sunday he came and brought his son, he lifted his son up in the sanctuary and commended his son to God. Interesting. Very powerful statement. And it made me think of this. You know, God, I didn't do well with my first children, but now I'm doing it right. And I'm commending this child to you and to your service. Very interesting. Okay, now let's move on now. Let's go to chapter 8 now, because we want to move on to the issue of Samuel is a prophet. He is a judge. We know he's called. We know he's appointed. He has been prepared even from his birth by his mother. And now then we find chapter 8 with Samuel, and something is now going on. Time has passed by. And we can tell that by the very first verse of chapter 8. So if someone now will go chapter 8, verses 1 through 9.
Now it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second, Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba, but his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice.
Does that sound familiar? There seems to be a problem with raising the children here, doesn't it? You know? He had Eli, who was an anointed priest, and he didn't raise his sons right. And now we have the same thing with Samuel. And so it's very intriguing. Continue on, please.
Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel in Ramah and said to him, Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. So Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me.
Okay, let's pause there. Isn't that a powerful statement? Samuel was, and they wanted a king. Now, as a backdrop to that, what had happened is they, militarily wise, were a loose military organization. They had the tribes, and they had warriors within all the tribes, and then at the leadership of a judge or whomever, they would go out and fight their battles against the Perizzites and the Hittites and the Canaanites and so forth. But what changed historically is the Philistines. The Philistines had the modern weapons. Modern weapons meant they had iron swords instead of brass. Meant they had chariots instead of just horses. And so militarily, they were far superior to them. And so what was going on is that we've been successful before, but now this other group of people who are well organized and militarily really astute are raiding us continuously at will, anytime they felt like it. And so to give us a little background, maybe part of the reason why they wanted a king is they wanted protection. Because the other countries had kings. And I'm sure the Philistines had kings, and they seem to be doing superior to us, and we're at threat now. And so it seems to be a little more behind the background. One is your sons are bad, and we've already had to deal with Eli and his sons, so we're not going another generation of bad sons. Okay, we're just not going to go there, But at the same time, too, that's a little bit of the background history of what's going on. So go ahead.
So they thought maybe a king would make better military decisions.
Yeah, that he would be
better
more
than that they could make.
And you hear what they said, and read that again. Then why did they want a king? I guess start in verse 7. Oh no, let's go there. Verse 4 and 5.
Okay. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations.
Okay, why did they want a king?
So that he could judge them like the other nations.
That's right. They wanted to be like them. They wanted an organized military led by a king. Because the kings led the military as well as they led religious.
Another thing, too, then the people, their own people, wouldn't hold them responsible for death and plundering that might go on, via a war.
Yeah. So there were some reasons behind it, But that's not how God interpreted that. And so what did he say about them rejecting Samuel? Because Samuel evidently felt bad. And you can imagine, he's been doing this since he was a child. Now he's old. And they're saying, we don't want you any longer. You're old. We don't want you any longer. We want a king. And so you can imagine how he felt then. I've led you loyally over all these years. Now you tell me I'm old and you don't want me any longer. And you want a king. And so you can imagine his own feelings. And so then what was his response then?
His response in verse 7 is, and the Lord said to Samuel, heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them.
Okay. In my translation it says, they rejected me for being king over them. And this is another issue too. God was their king, working through the anointed judge. Now they say, no, we want a king. And so now the affront is to God. Because intentionally or not, they're saying, we no longer have God as our king. We now want a person as our king. Because it's what judges, what the other countries have. Very significant, isn't it? And so there's an affront to Samuel, and more importantly, there's an affront to God. Okay. And that's a big change in their history. A real big, significant change, shift in their history, because now they're moving from judges to kings. And for those who read the scripture, they know all did not go well with kings, did it?
No.
Okay, all right. Okay, so be careful what you ask for. Okay, now let's take a look at chapter, let's see. Yeah, 10 through 18. Let's go there. Now he starts to tell them, here's what's going to happen. This is going to be, some of the results of you wanting to have a king, and I'm going to give it to you. So chapter 8, verses 10 through 18. If someone would take that.
And Samuel told all the words of the Lord unto the people that asked of him a king. And he said, This will be the manner of the king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for himself, for his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and some shall run before his chariots. And he will appoint him captains over thousands, and captains over 50s, and will set them to ear his ground, and to reap his harvest, and to make his instruments of war, and instruments of his chariots. And he will take your daughters to be confectionaries, and to be cooks, and to be bakers. And he will take your fields and your vineyards, and your olive yards, even the best of them, and give them to his servants. And he will take the tenth of your seed and of your vineyards, and give it to his officers and to his servants. He will take your manservants and your maidservants and your goodliness, young men, and your asses, and put them to his work. He will take the tenth of your sheep, and you shall be his servants. You shall cry out in that day because of your king which you shall have chosen you, and the Lord will not hear you in that day.
Wow. And that's something. That's right. So he warned them, didn't he?
Sure did.
Now understand, now this is the people who already give the tithe. And you're hearing a tenth again, aren't you? Not only are you giving the tithe unto the Lord, and that hasn't stopped, but now he's going to take a tithe of your, what is it, your vineyards?
Yeah, the fields, your
Your
vineyards,
fields and your vineyards.
olive groves.
And he's going to take the best too. Now, what were they supposed to give to God when it came to the quality of their offerings?
Their best.
The best.
Oh, I'm sorry. Their best.
That's right. So now then, he's rivaling them with God, isn't he? They're required by Levitical law to give the best without blemish to the Lord, your first fruits. But now he's telling them, no, the king that you want is not going to take your best. And so now it leaves them in a quandary. Am I going to give it to the king who's going to take it, my best, or do I give it to the Lord? So now they're in a situation, which one do I serve? The king who we asked for, or the Lord who is our king and our God? So they put themselves in a different situation. And that last statement, read that last verse again, is very indicting.
Verse 18.
18, yeah.
Verse 18, And ye shall cry out in that day because of your king which ye shall have chosen you, and the Lord will not hear you in that day.
Okay.
Will not hear you.
Yeah. So after you cry about what they are doing to you, then God is not going to hear you. All right. Very interesting, isn't it? If you want to know why we pay so much taxes to go to our military, this is a part of the reason why. This is a part of the reason why we spend so much money on our military. Okay, so now we find out, they're going to have a king. And then now go to chapter 9, and we have their king chosen.
But yeah, Pastor, one very important thing though, even though he told them that didn't make a difference to them. No. They still wanted their king.
That's right.
They still wanted someone to figure out how to win their battles and fight their battles for them.
That's right.
So he warned them and told them everything that was going to happen, and that the Lord would not hear them in that day, and it did not matter.
Yeah. You know, I'm treading on very delicate ground here when I say this. The Wesleys who started the Methodist movement never intended nor did they want bishops. It was after they died, then Asbury, who took over, he created the position of bishop. So it's very interesting, isn't it? Very, very interesting, you know. And like I say, I'm treading on very delicate ground here, you know. But it's historically accurate, you know. And so then we have the system we have now, not by the intent of those who founded this denomination, but those who succeeded them then created that position. Very interesting. Okay. All right then. All right, let's move on now. Then we have in chapter 9 then, we have their first king. And so let's get started in chapter 9. If you would go 9, 1 through 2. 1 and 2.
was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Bechorath, the son of Aphiah, a Benjamite, a mighty man of power. And he had a choice and handsome son whose name was Saul. There was not a more handsome person than he among the children of Israel. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people.
He was tall and handsome, right? Okay. Can anyone recount when it came to the point of David, what God had to say how he chose a leader? Anybody remember that? Okay.
Young and innocent, or a pure heart?
Close, very close when you said the heart. Yes,
okay.
You hit it when you said the heart. Yeah, you got it there. He says, man chooses from the outside, but God chooses by the heart. Yeah. And so we find here, and there's no mention of his heart, is there?
No.
It just talked about how tall he was and how handsome he was.
The outward appearance.
The outward appearance, yes.
Well, from the King James Version, chapter 9, verse 2, it states, and he had a son whose name was Saul, and chose a young man and godly.
Oh.
And there was not among the children of Israel a gooder person than he.
Okay, so they included godly in the King James Version. Very interesting, because in the newer translations they don't say godly. Okay, but we do know that Saul started off well, didn't he? He started off real well in battle. He started off real well in his administration. Samuel anoints Saul. He does what the people wants. Consecrate, lay hands on, is what we do today. So he sent him off and chose this handsome fellow to be the leader of God's people. Okay, but we know as an account that is that it didn't go well with Saul, did it? And so when we find out then is that we start to see some unsavory things. Go to chapter 13 if you would, please. How are we on our time? Okay. All right, we'll start wrapping this up here. Okay, chapter 13, someone read 1 through 5, please. 1 through 4.
Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, Saul chose him 3,000 men of Israel, who of 2,000 were with Saul in Mishmash and in Mount Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin. And the rest of the people he sent every man to his tent. And Jonathan smote the Garshin of the Philistines that was in Gibeah, and the Philistines heard of it. And Saul blew the trumpet throughout all the land, saying, let the Hebrews hear. And all Israel heard say that Saul had smitten the Garshin of the Philistines, and that Israel also had in an abomination with the Philistines. And the people were called together after Saul to Gilgal.
Okay. All right. So remember I said historically it was the Philistines who had the organized army. They had the latest weaponry when it came to iron implements, swords, and spear tips. And they also had chariots, which were the state-of-the-art when it came to military tools. But now they're being defeated, aren't they? So one of the things that they wanted, they're actually getting. And that's a king to help defeat the Philistines who were raiding them and were a nemesis to them. And so at this point, everything seems to be fine. Everything's going well. Now someone read verse 5 through 13.
And then the Philistines gathered themselves together to fight with Israel, 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and people as the sand which is on the sea shore in multitude. And they came up, pitched in Michmash, eastward from Bethavan. When the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait, for the people were distressed, then the people did hide themselves in caves and in thickets and in rocks and in high places and in pits. And some of the Hebrews went over Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. As for Saul, he was yet in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. He tarried 7 days according to the set time that Samuel had appointed. But Samuel came not to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. And Saul said, Bring hither a burnt offering to me and peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. And it came to pass that as soon as he had made an end of offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. And Saul went out to meet him, that he might salute him. And Samuel said, What hast thou done? And Saul said, Because I saw that the people were scattered from me, and that thou camest, and not within the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered themselves together at Michmash. Therefore said I, The Philistine will come down now upon me to Gilgal, and I have not made supplication unto the Lord. I forced myself therefore, and offered a burnt offering. And Samuel said to Saul, Thou hast done foolishly. Thou hast not kept the commandments of the Lord thy God, which he commanded thee. For now would the Lord have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever.
Interesting, isn't it? Mm-hmm. What do you think about that? Because here we have, he's in battle. He's outnumbered. They even gave. Remember he said about the Philistines? You know, they came down to fight with 30,000 chariots. Remember, the state-of-the-art weaponry. 6,000 horsemen, which is also state-of-the-art. Troops like sands of the seashore in multitude. And they encamped at Michmash, getting ready to fight the Israelites. So evidently there was a time that Samuel had told him to wait before he would arrive, and he would then give the offering. And take a look at verse 8. How long was that time?
7 days.
7 days.
7 days. 7 days. Did he show up at the 7 days?
No, he did not.
Yes. Okay, so Samuel's in a twitch here. And you also take a look and see what was happening with his men.
They were dwindling. They were dwindling, scattering.
Yeah. Yeah. So he has a multitude of the finest trained and equipped military ready to siege against them. His men are dwindling and running away. They said they were depressed and they were trembling. You know, he needed something to bring them together. You know, God fought for them, as we well know. The Ark of the Covenant many times went before them. He needed to be able to do what needed to be done religiously to prepare their hearts and their minds to fight this great enemy. And he's supposed to wait those 7 days, and Samuel didn't show.
It shows too that man cannot do what God does, in the past and the present and the future.
Yes.
Because the times that they depended on God, they start thinking, can we depend upon this man? And they start scattering.
Good.
We can't depend upon this man. He's going to do something else other than what God did for us.
Yeah. So they were fearful. They started scattering. And then it's kind of an interesting thing, you know, that Samuel comes late. You're going to say something?
I was going to say, isn't it just typical, though? We cry and complain and cry and complain. They cried and complained. They wanted this king. They got their king, but he was terrible. You know, they're running off, hiding in caves and in thickets and in rocks and holes and pits.
Yeah.
You know, so, you know, be careful what you ask for.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so as a result of this now then, Samuel said he forced himself. You hear that? He forced himself to go ahead and do this, you know, because he's afraid too, you know, because he's about to be overrun with this military that is totally equipped. But then Samuel's take on that was interesting, though, wasn't it? Take a look at verse 13 and 14. Someone read 13 and 14 for us.
And Samuel said to Saul, "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever.
But verse 14.
But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be commander over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you."
Wow, isn't it? Now, let's ask you this then. How important is it for God, based on what we just saw here, that those who are supposed to lead God's people do just what God says? Well, what does that say to you? How important is it to God that those whom he has called to lead God's people do exactly what he has said?
It's extremely important to him because he chose you.
Yeah.
I mean, he plucked you up out of the midst of a whole lot of other people and gave you direction. So it's very important to him.
And why is it so important to God that this person who he has chosen be very specific and follow his directions to the letter?
Because you are speaking for God, acting for God. God talked to you and gave you direction so that you could lead the people.
And hearing from someone else now then, what's the consequences to the people if those who are called by God do not follow God's direction to the letter? What's the consequences to the people?
Well, the consequence is whatever you do against God, they're just like if you disobey a parent, there's going to be a consequence.
Yeah.
There's going to be, especially with a warning, I warned you, don't do this. So the king is doing this, my own leader is doing this, my own parent is doing this, so I'm going to go ahead and follow their ways.
Exactly. That's the gravity of it. Because if either by God or by man someone is appointed into a leadership position, people are going to respect the leadership position, aren't they? We have been told to follow the leader because of their position, because there's a feeling that God has called them, that person has been trained and appointed and assigned. So then our duty is to follow who God has called, because we're not to judge who God has called, and to be obedient to follow it. So then therefore the consequences are grave to the people. Because now then, if that person who is called by God, that means whether you're the head of the steward board, trustee board, stewardess board, usher board, choir, whatever your leadership position is, if you are not following God to the letter, you're going to mislead the people who are following you. If you're not leading by example, you're going to mislead the people who are following you. And so therefore, it's grave importance that those who take on any position of leadership in the name of God, meaning in this case, in our case, the church, that they be very prayerful, that they are always seeking God and seeking his direction so that they are not misleading someone else. Go ahead, Ray.
I see a difference between Saul and David. David was always taking care of something, making it safe for something, the sheep and the lambs and everything. But Saul never did those things. Saul was just a good-looking person. It's like the Kennedy of his day, And there's a difference.
Yeah.
Because your heart is being prepared already for the things that you've been doing.
Yeah. Well, why you still have it? In that verse 14, it says that God has appointed him a ruler over his people because he has not kept the Lord. And it says here, before that, the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. What king was identified as a man after God's own heart?
And that's David.
David. That's right. David.
Yeah.
And so therefore, it's the heart, isn't it?
Yes.
Again, because to your point then, where your heart is, your actions are going to follow. If your heart is after gain, you're going to go after gain. If your heart is after reputation, you're going to go after reputation. If your heart is after influence and power, you're going to have to go after influence and power. But if your heart is after God, then you're going to go after God. And that's what you're going to seek, and that's what you're going to direct.
Saul had a goodly heart, not a godly heart. But that wasn't enough for some of us. It's another step from goodlier to godly,
Yes.
you know. And we've had a lot of good men of our days, but yet and still they couldn't lead because they weren't godly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Difference, isn't it?
Yes.
There's a difference between a nice atheist and a person of God. A nice atheist is a nice person. You know, they'll speak to you nicely, they'll talk to you nicely, they'll be friendly to you, but they don't believe in God, you know. And so you would not want a good, nice atheist over God's house. Even though they might be proficient with money or they might be proficient in leadership, they have to have a heart after God. And that was make a difference, because eventually you're going to be put in a situation where you're going to have to choose God, or you're going to have to choose what people want. And if your heart is after power, control, influence, and money, you will do what the people want because you feel like that's the means to your end. Go ahead.
I don't want to prolong this, but I heard on the TV that the president appointed 2 men as leaders because of qualification, not because they look like him.
Yeah. He also appointed them because of their qualifications, not because they were a woman or because they were a minority or whatever. And now he's being criticized because, you know, it looks like Mad Men, they said, in the White House now, all white males, you know. So, but we know when it comes, in my own opinion, whenever it comes to President Obama, whatever he does, somebody's going to criticize it, you know. If he turned left, they say he should have turned right. If he said yes, they should have said no, you know. If he wore brown shoes, he should have worn black shoes, you know. So that we understand why that's all that. Okay, so we're running out of our time here. We just kind of settled here on Samuel and Saul, and now we're ready to go into David. So we're going to leave it at this point with David. David ends up being a good king. However, David does some wrong things. Can anybody point out one thing that David did wrong? One violation he did?
He actually took another man's wife.
There you go. There is a commandment against there, is there not? Thou shalt not commit adultery. Okay. Yeah, and actually several things. One is that you shall not covet thy neighbor's wife. He did that. You shall not commit adultery, which he did. You should not kill, which he did. And you should not bear false witness, which he did. So he hit several of them. He hit several of them. He was a man after God's own heart, but even a man after God's own heart sometimes can fall. And there's consequences when he did that too. Okay, any other questions? Final questions? Okay, any comments? All right, let's close out then. All right. Okay. Before we close out, here's the assignment for next week. Day 1, Kings 16:29 through 19, verse 18. Day 2, 1 Kings 19 and on. You see that day 3, Amos 1 through 4. Day 4, Amos 5 through 9. And day 5, Isaiah 1 through 7 and Jeremiah 2. So anyway, for those of you online, we're glad to have you back. Glad you have part of our class. Just stop and pause the YouTube video there and get your assignments. Be sure and write us. Be sure and email us and let us know what your questions are and what your interests are. Okay? All right. God bless you. We'll see you next week.